to Okay, we are now recording. I would like to quickly introduce our AltAc rock star that we will be chatting with today. This is Jennifer, or Jenn Weintraub. Jenn and I actually had the pleasure to meet in fall when I was invited to do a little chat on kind of the same sort of stuff we talk about here: alternative academic career spaces, what the job market looks like, what you can do when you're in your program to prepare for the job market and prepare for careers in these sorts of non-university but still resource intensive academic career spaces. After the session, Jenn emailed me and kind of shared a bit about her background, her current position, and then very generously offered to contribute to the session, to our series. So, fast forward a couple, 6 or so COVID months later, and some scheduling issues and whatnot, and here we are today, nonetheless. So very big thank you, first of all, to everybody for being here today, but definitely to Jenn for taking the time to prep with us a couple times, and then just taking the time to chat today and share your experiences. And I know that you've also very generously allowed us to share your contact information. So we will be posting that with the session recording and outline of questions that we post to our website. So you very well might be getting some folks reaching out to you in the future. So in order to make the most of our time today, I'm just going to dive right in and just start going. So Jenn, we know you're in a really interesting position now, working as a legislative director within the New York State legislature, which I'm so excited to hear about because I know nothing about this sort of career space. But before we jump into that stuff, I was hoping that you might tell us just really quickly a bit about your pathway. I understand you're currently ABD in the School of Criminal Justice at University of Albany, SUNY. Is that right?
Yes. So I'm going into I almost don't want to say it, I'm going into my 7th year, but hoping to wrap up soon. I did my bachelor's and my master's here also through the combined program, and then decided to go for the PhD. Way back originally, I started as a Spanish major in undergrad with a plan to attend law school, but then I took some CJ courses, got into some research, and once I got through the master's program and started working on a few projects, I realized I had found a solid mentor that I loved working with, and basically refused to leave.
There you go. Mentorship's important. That's definitely how I picked my program. I think that's how a lot of people do. So you mentioned that you were interested in becoming a lawyer at one point. I know you said in previous conversations you're really interested in kind of the context in which different legal decisions are made and that sort of stuff. So what's the focus of your dissertation? What's kind of the focus and direction of your personal research agenda?
Yeah, I tried to really tie that all together for my dissertation. So for that, I've conducted quite a few qualitative interviews with folks from different innocence organizations. So those are the very generous people who are trying to exonerate those who are convicted of a crime that they didn't commit, to try to determine how their intake policies are chosen, what kinds of cases they take, and what those choices might kind of mean for the landscape of wrongful convictions as we know them. So that's a pretty straight continuation of my research agenda so far. I've done a lot of work in the wrongful conviction space. It's what I'm most passionate about. And I've honestly been feeling a little bit disconnected from it between the pandemic and being super busy with just writing the dissertation and working and all that fun stuff. So I think there's definitely more to explore as it comes to their intake policies beyond my dissertation, but I've also done some work on prosecutorial misconduct and the folks who actually commit those crimes, the true perpetrators, that I'd really like to continue with.
Really, really interesting. So I've got a really small question for you. When we first met 6-8 months ago or so, what spurred your interest to kind of reach out about contributing to and being involved with the AltAc series? I've talked about my experiences in my program and kind of how at the time in my program, there was not good training, even though my personal mentors were phenomenal and provided a bunch of great opportunities. I felt a real lack of preparation in order to really kind of know how to set myself up well. Can you share a little bit about your experience and kind of what your impetus was for very generously donating your time this morning?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I had pretty much an identical experience. Having, attended the talk that you gave to the department, my program was very similar. Like others that I've heard about, never really spoke about or really prepared us for any career trajectory outside of academia. I don't know whether that was intentional or not, but either way, I really didn't hear much about any opportunities outside of academia, but I've had some great mentors, including my direct advisor, who have either graciously accepted that I'm going to disappoint them by leaving academia, or are just very happy and encouraged my interest in policy. So, and I was also lucky enough that these people happen to share my research interests too, because I'm not sure if I really would have come to them or found them if they didn't. So I got really, really fortunate. I also came to a point where like I had wondered what was out there. I had obviously started working in the space and found that others had not really had the same experience where they hadn't heard much about AltAc careers. So started sharing with them, and I wish I had heard about these types of careers earlier in my PhD. I was lucky enough to still land somewhere amazing with where I am now, but it was definitely a matter of luck and coincidence and not actual preparation.
Yeah, so I'm definitely curious to hear how you mentioned once you got into your career space, you were learning different things and wanted to stay in that and really interested in the policy development portion of things. But I'm interested in how you actually like your pathway to get to that career space. So I feel like maybe this is just me, but I feel like working for the state legislature sounds like a super exotic sort of job to me. I don't know anything about it. I mean, that's unfortunate to say because one of the main consumers of my current work in my current position with Oregon DOC are the legislature.
Right.
However, I really don't know anything about this. So how did you get to where you are? What sort of kind of prior experiences, volunteer, internship, kind of like what got you to where you are today? I assume it wasn't a simple Craigslist ad looking for a legislative director and they just kind of settled on you. How'd you get to where you are?
No, and I think I had kind of not a weird path. I didn't have necessarily a typical path, but I like the word exotic to describe it because it feels very much like when I'm speaking with folks in academia that they're like, whoa, what, like what is that?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's an interesting space to be in coming from academia, but I've never really been, it's not even like I've really been interested in local politics before or anything. So a lot of my like kind of quote unquote relevant experience was just a matter of being a grad student in need of funding. So I worked for our state's Division of Criminal Justice Services for a year while I was doing my master's, which is where I kind of first got the taste about what it's like to work at a state agency. It wasn't a great fit, so I moved on to TAing and ultimately teaching undergrads at the university, which I think also helped. I tried to incorporate some policy teaching and information to my courses there, which is where I kind of started really learning more about it. I loved teaching, but also realized that I still wanted to change. I did this a lot throughout grad school where I just kind of kept taking different opportunities as they arose to figure out what I liked and what I wanted. So after that, I ended up working for a research center called the Center for Human Services Research. And I got to do some program evaluation and focus a little bit more on policy there. And just academically too, I've always been really interested in policy making and policy choices, especially in the wrongful convictions context. But what really the two things that were preceding my time with the senator is that first I took a class called legislative advocacy because it just sounded really cool. And I didn't really have a clue about how the legislature worked or anything like that. But it was taught by an adjunct who had previously worked in the legislature, and he had brought in a bunch of guest speakers who currently worked there to describe what they do and what it means. And that was so interesting. And I think that's where I learned about the fellowship that I ended up applying for. So the New York State Senate um, has a fellowship program for postgrads. And it was, so in my cohort, it was mostly recent law grads, a couple of MPA grads, myself, and one other PhD student in that cohort. So I applied to that fellowship. And that's really where I got my foot in the door. And I was placed with Senator Gianaris when I applied to the fellowship, and got lucky enough to stay afterwards.
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, we've talked a little bit about um, like postdoc programs and fellowships with NIJ and that sort of context. But I will be the first to say I was completely ignorant that there could be fellowships through kind of like state and local government like that.
Yeah.
Even being somebody who's worked in county and state government for 5 years now, I had absolutely no idea that that was an area that you could look for kind of fellowship opportunities like that.
And it's funny because they never really advertised, they didn't advertise to my department at all, which I always thought was strange. So I actually found it through like our public policy college, and through that class I took too, it had been publicized. So that's really the only way I found it at that point too.
Wow, that's really interesting. Okay, so let's talk about some of the realities of your current position, what it means to kind of work in the state legislature in a legislative director position. That's your title, right?
Yes.
And you work with one specific senator.
Yes, so I work specifically for Senator Gianaris on his legislative priorities.
Okay, so again, I'm super interested in hearing like what the day-to-day of your job is like. Can you give us some kind of like big picture idea of what like doing research looks like in the context of your specific career space?
Yeah, it's similar to academia in some ways and obviously different in others. So for me, doing research is much faster usually and kind of smaller in scope, but pretty much just as thoroughly as it is in academia. So my job day to day is to do what the senator doesn't always have time to do. And by that, I mean almost never, because he's very busy or at least can't do so extensively, is getting really ingrained in like a niche topic or area or issue for a project or two, usually a bill or two. So that part is actually kind of like academia, where you're interested sometimes in like this smaller area and learning extensively about it.
Are you talking like doing extreme lit review sort of things? Again, apologies for the ignorance, but I'm like, what okay. Talk about this in words that I understand.
Yes, that's pretty much, I mean, kind of that's what it is. So say we're, I'm helping him draft a new bill or something. So I'm not only looking at what the words for the law will be itself, but the background. So sometimes that does involve, if there are scholarly works on a particular policy, that's always super useful. It doesn't happen a lot, but that can be super useful about the background of the issue itself. What other states, sometimes there's like state by state comparisons or nation by nation comparisons on similar policies. So I'll look at those and see what's out there, how can we adapt if we can adapt it. And though sometimes I'm doing like a lit review with academic work, sometimes it's kind of doing a lit review with other pieces of sources like policy briefs or taking case law and kind of breaking that down into a lit review, looking at other bills, looking at news articles. But essentially what I do when I'm researching for a bill is kind of like a lit review and then taking that and condensing that to the point where doing it a lot faster and then condensing it to the point where it can be shared and distributed and go to whoever it needs to. And honestly, most of the time when I'm putting that kind of lit review together, I'm on the phone or Zoom nowadays, or hopefully in person soon, with people who know way more than me about whatever the topic is and learning from them and including that stuff too.
So that's really, really interesting. So it's almost like a very high speed, pointed collation of information from all different sources that can just help to create the best picture with regards to case law, any empirical work on the issue, diving deep into what is in the popular news surrounding different movements in that area. And wow, it sounds like it's almost like creating a huge library of information about very pointed issues in a really small time frame.
Exactly, pretty much.
So can you give some examples of things that you've thought have been like super interesting projects that you've been really excited about, and just kind of more, now that we know a little bit about kind of what it looks like, what are some of the cooler subject matter areas, I guess you could say?
Yeah, so my senator in particular, and a lot of senators do this thing where like they are kind of ingrained in certain areas. So there are some who do like a lot of criminal law work, and some who touch on everything, and some who specialize. My senator, my boss, as deputy majority leader, which essentially makes him second in command, he touches a lot of different things because he's just kind of part of leadership and moving around. So it's actually funny because one of the most interesting things I've worked on so far is not really within criminal justice at all. I guess a little bit by a stretch, but so one of his big priorities right now is this antitrust reform bill. So it's basically like monopolies and big players who are using abusive practices to kind of monopolize a market. And so he's introduced that bill. It passed the Senate this past session. It's probably the biggest project I've worked on in the office so far as how long it took to research and assist in drafting the bill. And also I say assist because there are so many people whose hard work and input goes into a really good piece of legislation. And most of all, it's my senator's leadership that makes it what it is. But essentially, to get started on the project, I read a few academic works to try to, like, there's a decent amount out there from law professors about antitrust to get myself acquainted, having never heard of antitrust before, and then spent some time with the case law, which was super instructive. The senator and I spent countless hours on Zoom calls with national experts, academic experts, like labor union representatives, government officials at the state and federal level, a whole bunch of other folks. And so after doing the reading and the talking, I did more reading based on what the experts suggested, called them back a lot of communication there. We had a hearing on the bill last September where essentially we invited those experts to come and testify firsthand, those who were in support of the bill and in opposition. So to get an idea of like, where are we coming from? What are folks who are opposed thinking about it? And ultimately, the senator introduced a really great piece of legislation to modernize New York's antitrust laws. So that was probably the biggest project I worked on. A little bit more in my wheelhouse, I got to work on a bill to codify a 24-hour limit on pretrial detention. And this was, the senator had asked that I poke around for a possible solution after the detentions in New York City happened during the BLM protests last year, with people being detained for far over the legal limit according to the case law and like kind of going missing. It was scary. People couldn't find them, and it ended up they were being detained for like way longer than they should have been. So I took a look at the case law. I discovered the legal rule that existed, and it actually hadn't been written into law yet. So I ended up pitching that idea to the senator and then to legal aid. And we kind of all worked together with them, with the assembly sponsor, with staffs in both houses, and got it passed last year. So that was a little bit more in my wheelhouse, which was nice, but it's kind of interesting to touch on different topics.
So two things from what you just said. First, you mentioned talking to, like, having direct conversations with people from all sorts of different kind of backgrounds and subject matter areas and whatnot during your information gathering portions of your work. I feel like maybe this is just my experience, but my program did a really great job of teaching me how to do a 12-minute ASC presentation and teaching me how to teach.
Yeah.
Ish. but that's very different sort of conversation than the sort of conversations you're having. I mean, you're still imparting information, very pointedly gathering information, but I mean, that's just like a completely different sort of skill set, I think. Did you have to kind of learn how to have those conversations, or are you generally just kind of more of a conversational, extroverted person?
Oh, no. And you're right. Yeah. So I had, the research presentations were definitely heavily emphasized in my program, but no, I've done a couple of things in the qualitative space, which I guess was kind of helpful. But really shadowing. So like part of my job is to staff the senator in some of his meetings and to also take my own meetings during session time. And so I think being able to shadow him and like kind of watch him take his meetings and like take notes and just be the absorber in that situation really helped me to take those meetings on my own. And sometimes we were together, sometimes we weren't. So that was really helpful. And I think that's something that I really mostly got kind of like on the job versus via training.
Interesting. So you also, I mean, you have, specifically going back to the second example that you talked about with the pretrial, the detention issue. So you kind of noticed an area where there was a gaping hole and then had, through your work, direct impact on policy. A lot of times in university settings, doctoral programs, I feel like a lot of people say, I'm interested in criminal justice policy. You are in a position where you are literally drafting policy. I don't think I've ever seen more of a direct policy connection than what you're talking about right now. And I guess maybe this again goes to just my ignorance of what the actualities of kind of politics is like. But that is like really, really cool to be able to have direct impact on, and then use your doctoral training to be able to identify good information to support your suggestions. I think it's just very, very cool.
Yeah, the pre-arraignment bill was especially exciting, like I said, coming from a criminal justice background, but it's fun to touch policy directly. It's also kind of scary, but it's a lot of fun.
So another couple questions. These are actually something that Shannon just sent over, which is just a great segue here. So it sounds like specifically with the senator you work with, that he touches lots of different areas.
Yeah.
But there's also opportunities to work with folks who might specialize in kind of specific subject matter policy areas. Can you talk a little bit more about how you found the senator that you're working for, if there's ways to find somebody who works in very specific areas, or if you can even, if you have, as a legislative director, a great idea that might be of interest to multiple different senators, can you kind of pitch ideas around? What does that kind of look like?
Yeah, so first of all, so the way I got placed with my senator was, I'm actually not totally sure because I was placed through the fellowship, but I had indicated kind of what my interests were and what my background was in, and he had done some innocence bills in the past. So I think that's probably how I ended up getting placed with him. And so yeah, so different, at least for, and I'm assuming this translates to different legislatures, it might not, but at least for the members in the Senate, even on the website, you can see like there are folks who are chairs of different committees, maybe. So like the person who's the chair of the elections committee does a lot of elections work generally and kind of stuff like that. And there are folks who pick kind of their interest, what's best for their constituency, maybe that's what they focus on, but a lot of them have focus areas. And as someone in my position, like if I had a policy idea, which policy ideas come from like everywhere. We've done things that constituents in the district have asked of us, that we thought, that the senator thought was a great idea. It really comes from everywhere. And that's not limited to the staff. So sometimes the staff will come up with something and that turns into something. So in my position, you really do work for your individual senator. So like if I had a great idea, but it was related to transportation, I wouldn't go shop that to whoever the other senator is. I would raise it with mine, and then he might say like, oh, that sounds great for Senator whomever, like maybe see if they want to do it and we can work together, because sometimes senators will kind of share like the sponsorship of a bill. Yeah, and
Okay,
that's
so it does seem,
which is great.
sorry, what was that?
I said that's happened before, which is great too, just like ideas coming from staff and finding a place and going through.
Mhm. So it is kind of more senator specific, individual specific, who you're working with. And in your experience, have you seen situations kind of like cyclical where different policy windows open up as a response to certain kind of, you know, movements or things that are happening in just kind of the socio-political context? Or is it also just kind of like fair game if you have a good idea? How does that, is there kind of, I guess what I'm asking is more like the timing of how and when you raise certain issues?
It's definitely a mix. So like if there's a great policy idea, but there's no real national movement or local movement behind it, that doesn't mean it won't get introduced or worked on or passed. Sometimes the legislature does like packages of bills. So they'll pass like a package of elections bills all at once in one day or something. And sometimes things will get included in a package. I think it certainly helps sometimes if there is like some sort of movement or some sort of local happening, just because it draws media attention, which generally, if we can get constituents, and if you can get, you know, if the constituency of New York is focused on something, then chances are it's going to, it might have an easier time moving through the legislature, just because that's what everyone is focused on. So I would say that some of it is a little reactive, and then some of it is stuff that's been worked on for years, and then just like finally got to a good place, and finally everyone's on board and everyone's happy, or as many people as can be are happy, and it can move forward then.
Interesting. Okay, so I guess you touched on this a little bit before, but I just want to ask it kind of more directly. So methodologically speaking, kind of the research component of what you do. I mean, you've mentioned both secondary and primary data collection, or secondary data analysis and primary data collection. I mean, all of these conversations that you have, you might not be then, you know, coding the information and creating a qualitative data set out of it, but that's primary data collection in order to get the very strategic information that you're looking for. Do you do kind of like actual policy evaluation and program evaluation through your position, or are you more kind of, because things need to be really fast paced, you're more looking to see what's out there and then distilling the information down? What does that look like?
It can be a combination of both. I mean, I think there's really some policy evaluation that goes into it, especially if I'm looking at what other places have done and like analyzing how it's worked over there and how it's different from the environment in New York, maybe, or maybe it's a municipal policy and I'm looking at how it might translate to the state level. So there's definitely a lot of that in there. There's a lot of that in there too, if say someone brings the senator a bill and asks him to pick it up himself, or asks him to sign as a co-sponsor, so like as a supporter of a bill that someone else already has. I think there's like a lot of kind of evaluation there. And interestingly, I never really thought about the meetings as primary data collection, but you're right. And it's funny because a couple weeks ago, I was taking a look at some opposition memos we had received on a bill. So folks who had written in and say like, we oppose this bill and this is why. And I caught myself without really realizing it. I was kind of taking notes, and then I opened a spreadsheet and started kind of like putting together a matrix for it. And it was really helpful because I got to see kind of like coding wise, what are the primary topics that, and my senator asked me like, what are the biggest noted concerns? And I was able to kind of just like look across my table and give him that, which was really, I didn't even notice I was really doing it. And then I finished it and looked at it and I was like, this is a matrix.
Wow, what an amazing segue, because the next question that I have on my list is literally, this might sound basic, but how do you use your doctoral training and subject matter expertise in your current position? Clearly, methodologically, that's a way.
Yes, it
So,
is.
so how else? How do you, like there's very specific things that we tend to learn in PhD programs in the criminology and criminal justice, social sciences areas. So how do you, not to sound super reductionist or anything, but how do you use that sort of stuff on a day-to-day basis in your position?
I think that definitely is a part of it. I mean, maybe other people are doing charts and stuff too, and maybe not saying like, oh, that's a matrix. But I also find, right, like in my position, I'm mostly surrounded by lawyers. I mean, the majority of folks in my spot are lawyers. There are a couple of MPAs. There's one other PhD graduate and at least one other PhD candidate, but the vast majority have a law degree. And so I think stuff like that. I think I might tend to incorporate or at least start with academic work more so than other folks do, and academic voices, and saying like, especially if it's in criminal justice and I can, like, the topic comes up and I can picture who would be like a really good resource for it in mind. And I'll try to look there at least first to get some sort of background. I just think it's a more, maybe others do it too, but I think for me, it's like a kind of a natural starting point, because what we do when, like we're looking for like a background in a topic we're interested in is we turn to the lit. And so I try to turn to the lit and to the people. And I also think that at first, I especially had a harder time with the short deadlines than folks who aren't coming from a background like mine, because we're often working under really tight deadlines during the legislative session. And with research, I'm just kind of used to being able to like take my time, ponder, keep collecting and sit on things. Whereas during session, it's really way faster.
So fast timelines is one of the things that I'm hearing for sure.
Yeah.
Fast-paced work environment. So I want to touch briefly on something you just mentioned that takes me back. I'm seeing a thread through the discussions that we've had with multiple of our rock stars, our AltAc rock stars that we've had meet and greets with. And that's this concept of knowing who to go to in order to talk to the expert in the area. And I think that's really important, because I think a lot of times, and maybe this is just my perception of things, but a lot of times in doctoral programs and just the kind of folks that we interact with, you need to be the expert in the room at all times. You have to have an immediate answer to a question.
Yeah.
If you don't, that's a personal failing sort of thing. Yet I've heard a lot of rock stars saying that I need to know who to talk to in order to get the best answer to this question on a quick, turnaround.
Yeah.
Not that I need to be the person that can answer any question that anybody ever throws at me.
Right.
And I think that that's a really, I feel like that gets at imposter syndrome a lot, that people like, I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head. I need to either make something up or I need to talk in circles around it so they realize I'm not actually answering the question or something like that,
Yeah.
Just, I think there's an uncomfortability. Is that a word? There's people are uncomfortable with not having a direct answer or not necessarily being the expert in a specific area. But now you and multiple other rock stars have mentioned one of the things I need to know my people can do is find the expert in order to get the best information, and knowing how to distill that down is so important. So I just wanted to kind of vocalize that connection that I had made through what you've been saying and what we've heard others talk about.
It's true. A lot of the time I have like a whole, right, like spreadsheet of folks who do different issues, different advocacy groups. I think sometimes I do have the imposter syndrome still, where I feel like I have to know the answer if like I'm in a meeting and I'm meeting with an advocacy group or a constituent or something, and they're asking me about maybe one of the senator's bills that I've obviously helped draft. Then I kind of get a moment of like, oh, I like really need to know. Or if the senator's on the floor of the during session debating one of the bills, at times I'll be asked to come down to the chamber, which is really exciting, but honestly kind of horrifying, and kind of sit in the back and if there's a question that comes up about the bill during debate that he needs an answer to on the floor, then he might turn to me and say, like, what is the answer to the question? So most of the time I get to go to someone else, or at least confirm with someone else. But yeah, there are definitely times too where like the academic imposter syndrome pops up because I'm like, oh, I should know this right now and don't have time to go look.
Yeah, I think we all get that. I mean, I know I do on
Yeah.
a daily basis, if not multi-times daily basis at times.
Yeah.
Okay, so just a couple more questions about the logistics of your current position before we switch gears. So a couple things that we always like to ask. What's the hiring process like? Where do you look for these sorts of positions? What's the interview application process like? Anything that was really surprising to you? Timeline for one of these sorts of positions are posted, that sort of stuff. You just run through that really quickly.
Yeah, definitely. So like I said, I came in kind of not an unconventional route, but kind of a different route where like I came in through the fellowship. The fellowship is kind of known though for getting folks on board. I think it's something like in a quote normal year, in a non-COVID year, something like 75% of fellows end up somewhere within the legislature if that's where they want to stay. So you know, I got placed in the senator's office. My predecessor happened to leave 2 months into my fellowship, which was not anticipated. And so basically the way I got my job was that my senator came into the office in December, sat me down and said, like, treat this fellowship as a trial period. If you make it through, then the job is waiting for you when your fellowship is over. So super low pressure. So got through it. It was a COVID, you know, first year of COVID, but was hired on more traditional paths, I think. Honestly, I see a lot of LD legislative director postings just on like Indeed and kind of where you typically search for kind of a quote unquote regular posting, generally by individual offices. And depending on what your interests are, maybe different offices are better fits than others, but really there's an opportunity to learn any subject matter that you're not familiar with. And legislative experience I've seen is really important sometimes to making it far through these interviews and the hiring process. So any paid, unpaid, whatever experience can be really important. So if there are internships or fellowships and whatnot, or sometimes you can even contact an office that's doing something that you find interesting and say like, hey, do you need volunteers? Something like that can go a long way in the hiring process. And just for like coming from an academic background, when I was applying for the fellowship, I do remember panicking over whether I should send my CV or if I should send a resume, because I had no idea what they were looking for. There was no page limit or anything. Ended up sending over my CV and just hoping that, like, I don't know, they wanted all of my professional development and all the other, you know, stuff that goes on there. And I just think as far as surprising, the other thing that was kind of caught me off guard was I remember having a conversation with my chief of staff after my predecessor had left, but before I had spoken with the senator about taking the job. And he called me and was kind of lightly grilling me on like, you know, what's your background? And then finally came straight out and asked, like, why would someone like you, like, what's your 5-year plan? Like, what would someone like you with your background be doing in a policy setting? And at the time, it terrified me because I thought he was insinuating that like I wasn't suitable for the position. But I told him that I wanted to be in the policy space and that I was really interested. And looking back, I'm pretty sure he was just wondering if I was a potential candidate to take the job. And I think that's probably what it was. But at the time, it was like everything that I had kind of been ingrained, where it's like you need to go academic because you're doing a PhD, was kind of confronting me from the people in policy themselves. So that's not, I don't think, what it was, but it was kind of scary at the time. And then just timeline wise, I think during the off session, quote unquote, is when most folks move around and hire and stuff. So for New York, that's like mid-June to December. Although if people leave, generally those spots need to be filled pretty quickly.
All right. And so you mentioned places like Indeed, LinkedIn, that's how those positions are typically found?
Yep.
Good to get people ideas of where to go in order to find those positions. Again, I said that's so exotic sounding to me. I would have no idea. I would assume it's not on the ASC lister or the job posting board. Okay, so we've already talked about kind of the pace of your work, which is fast. Is it mostly done in a kind of like a collaborative setting or individual? I know you said a lot of information gathering is kind of collaborative, talking with people.
Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, there are parts that are individual, I guess, especially if it's on a really tight timeline and like something needs to be drafted today. But for the most part, it's a team setting. I mean, I have my team with the senator's office, which is, I work really closely with my colleague in the Albany office, my communications director. Him and I are always collaborating to try and complement the legislative to the media stuff. There's a lot of collaboration with other Senate staffers, like our central counsel, who specialize in different topics. And then I always kind of see, although it's always second to like what the senator is wanting to do and what best serves the office, his office, but I always see the folks we're working with on a piece of legislation also as kind of a team that like we can trade information with and work on something together. So I would say it's mostly collaborative.
Yeah, definitely sounds like it.
Yeah.
Last thing for real before we switch gears and talk about kind of your work doctoral candidate balance and what that's like.
Yeah.
What does research dissemination look like? Are you actually prepping deliverables? Bills, I assume, is the main thing that you're doing. But talk really quickly about that, and then we'll switch gears.
Yes, deliverables are mostly bills. And before that, it's background for bills, usually to my senator. So it's, like I said, taking as much information, putting it as concisely as possible, and my boss has taught me to be very, very careful with my words. So like every shall versus may, every permitted versus required, like all of that makes a really big difference when you're drafting something, because you know, it's gonna live forever. And then I guess the other type of deliverable that's big for an LD is the sponsors memo, which is basically something that's required to be filed with every bill. And it's like, what is a summary of the bill, what's its purpose, and what's its justification. And so that, again, is just a matter of being concise and understandable because it's public, so it's for everybody. LDs use it, you know, members use it, constituents look at it, but it also has to be concise enough that if a court is looking at it to determine a bill's purpose, that there's information there for it to be interpreted in the way that the senator, you know, is intending it to be.
So for that sort of stuff, I'm hearing like public facing, understandable to the general public sort of thing.
Exactly.
Which again is a very different skill than what my doctoral program taught me how to produce, you know. Okay. So you are not the first rock star that we've had that's in a dual position where they're working well in candidacy, but you are the first one that's been gracious enough to talk about what that actually looks like. In like the realities of it. So, you know, as we've talked about, you're currently ABD in candidacy and working a really time-intensive, pressure-driven position. So that's a lot to navigate. So first and foremost, like, let's talk about time. How do you find it necessary when you're in session to, you know, like balance things? Like, what does that look like? And is it hard for you, if you don't mind being like honest and vulnerable?
Oh, definitely. Happy to. Yeah. Time during session is really, really tough. I mean, quite honestly, I did not get especially as much, but really much at all done this session. And not just because it's a COVID year, but like during the midst of session, during the really nitty gritty parts of it, you know, I'll be working on things up to like 11, 12, 1, you know, and there's just no time, and up the next morning early to work on it. But time has been hard. COVID too, like I have a 7-year-old who did remote learning this year. So I was like trying to balance that with session, with dissertating. And so unfortunately that fell to the wayside quite a bit, but I'm very lucky that, like I've said, like my mentor, my advisor is so supportive. He always has been. I have a great colleague at the Senate in my office who also has an academic background, which is cool. So we can commiserate, and she reminds me to take the time that I have. And so I've been trying to work on it. I feel pretty disconnected from my doctoral program, to be honest. My advisor retired last year, so I speak with him via email. He's always been very hands off, like a send me what you have whenever you have it kind of guy. And I'm also in semi-regular contact with my committee too. But as far as time goes during the legislative session, it's really rough. The off session is really when I can, like, I got my interviews done and that kind of thing can take time to just exclusively focus on it.
Mm-hmm. So I know you mentioned that your pathway into your position via your fellowship was a little bit different.
Yeah.
So I guess I drafted this question before knowing that exactly, but I'm going to ask the question anyways, which is
Okay.
at what point in the doctoral program experience did you go on the market and then accept your current position? Looking back, knowing hindsight's 2020, do you think you would have made a different decision? Or are you, again, this is, you do not have to answer these questions. I know these are very personal and whatnot, but are you happy with the decision that you've made and kind of where you are? And that's kind of where my head was when I drafted this.
Yeah, of course. I'm so happy. So I was at the end of my 4th year when I applied for the fellowship, hadn't yet defended my prospectus, did it a couple months later. And at the time, like in my department, I had been lucky enough to have assistantships, but for year 5, we were told that we were not going to be, the university was just not going to be able to fund us. So I really needed somewhere to go. I spent the first 4 years of my program working in assistantship and retail just to support my family. So the fellowship was quite honestly a pay bump. It was an experience I was super interested in having because I knew I wanted to go into policy, but it was a pay bump. It was the experience. And then I just got so lucky with the turn of events. Like I said, like my predecessor happened to leave. I happened to get that job, and not a lot of people in my fellowship class were so lucky because of the pandemic. Not a lot of offices were hiring like they usually were. So, and then on top of all that, the year after I completed my fellowship, they changed the fellowship rules so that you actually had to be post-degree. And so I couldn't have qualified anytime later anyway. So I got really lucky, and like sometimes I get a little scared looking back if I had made like one different decision that I wouldn't be in my office right now.
Well, it sounds like things worked out perfectly for you.
Yeah.
So, and I guess you mentioned this kind of briefly, but I'm going to ask the question anyways, which is, are there things from either side, either the doctoral program side or the working as a legislative director side, that you feel that you can't fully embrace or be fully invested in, fully involved with because of this dual positionality, which again, I think you kind of already alluded to, that you feel like you're a little bit disconnected from your program.
I do. It's really honestly my doctoral studies are what hurts the most. I think there's no real like allowance for anything less than 200% at the job because everything's so fast, it needs to be done and it has to happen on a timeline. Whereas the dissertation doesn't really have a deadline except for the one that I make up. My committee's understanding, so I have a lot of leeway there, which is hard to make peace with a lot of the time because I like to do everything at the highest level I can. So to admit that sometimes school suffers is hard. I've always gone for every grant, every, whatever, every recognition I can. And so, and also my research is just so interesting to me that, and I feel like it's so important that it almost feels like I'm betraying the community when I have to step back. So I just need to push through and get the dissertation done and then like be able to maybe have some more time to do more.
Well, thank you so much for, we're almost out of our time and I've left barely any time for questions and answers and comments and everything like that. But thank you so much, Jenn, for chatting with us today, for educating me as well as everybody else on the realities of kind of what your workspace is like. Definitely way more interesting than I had assumed that politics was, especially being somebody who's really invested in correctional policy and practice and whatnot. it's really awesome to know that you're the sort of person that's drafting these bills. I would say I feel quite a bit better knowing that. I would like to meet some of the legislative directors at my in Oregon here in my home state. So I guess just question to you, is there anything else that you would like to share that I haven't prompted or asked about? And then of course, we've got another 5, 6, 7 or so minutes for discussion for everybody who's in the audience. If anybody has any questions or comments or that sort of thing, I will leave the space open to you guys now.
Cool. Well, first of all, thank you. Like I love it when my worlds can collide. So really appreciate you having me and being able to share all of this. I think the only thing I would say is just like, you know, look out wherever you can. Sometimes you never know where an opportunity pops up that you might find really intriguing, you know, whether it's asking someone out to coffee that has a really cool job, or as far as trying to find an internship or something. Like you just, it's a cliche, but you never know. And also just academics, like please engage with your state legislature. Like we've been talking about, I talk to so many different people and they're all great, but rarely are they academics unless I like really go to them. So I think it's really important and really cool that you know, while I may be assisting in drafting and whatnot, like people from academia can have such an impact on where bills and policy goes. So that's it.
Well, thank you so much. We do have a couple of minutes if there's any questions, comments, discussion points, hilarious anecdotes anybody is interested in sharing before we sign off for the day.
I haven't received any questions in the chat, but you know, like I want to echo Kate's commentary about joining us. I think, you know, it's been so informative. I feel like it feels like it's so new to all of us, and I love Kate's commentary about, you know, your job being exotic, but because it seems so bizarre, like, oh wait, there's somebody obviously in there who is reading the research and thinking about where we should move, and then is directly moving us there, right, via policy. And so I think Kate's right, like being able to put, you know, faces to that process is certainly helpful, and to know that there are people shepherding those processes that have the credentials to do it and are thinking and are about those concepts and those ideas really hard. And so I love the idea of like a call to action to engage more with your legislature. I think that makes sense to me to say, hey, we're thinking about this. State legislature, you know, we being academia, or for me, I work in a research consulting firm. So, hey, we're thinking about this in our firm, you know, going to a state legislature and saying, you really should be thinking about writing policies like this based upon research we did in this one site or whatever.
Yeah, definitely.
I feel like that makes a lot of sense. Just again, another call to students, if you had any other comments, questions, or concerns.
All right, well, I guess we are encroaching on the end of our time this morning. So, I think that's a clap, not a hand up.
Yeah,
I can't tell. It's a clap, right? Okay. I'm not the best with these screen emojis or video emojis, Zoom emojis, whatever they are. Anyways, well, thanks everybody for attending. Thanks again, Jen, for your time and your candor in speaking with us and really opening my eyes and getting me stoked about working with my legislature in a different way than I already do in my professional capacity. So thank you for everything. Thank you, Shannon, for hosting via Zoom and the recording. And thank you everybody for attending. We will be posting this on the website if anybody would like to review our epic conversation. Otherwise, you will, on there, you'll be able to see Jen's contact information, which again, she has graciously allowed us to share moving forward. So thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great Friday, either morning or afternoon, depending on what time zone you are currently in. Thanks, everybody. Talk soon.
Perfect. Thank you.